Well, today we're in part 4 of our Ask Anything series. And if you haven't been here for that yet, it's a series where I put out a feeler for everyone just to ask questions. And I'll take the top 5 questions and answer them during the service, for a sermon. So we've done 3 already. We're in part 4. I've had a lot of fun doing them. I hope you have as well. You know, I've really enjoyed this series. And today we're tackling the big question. I'm really confused about the dinosaur time in history. Where is God in that? All right, so that's the big question, and I love that question. Confused about the dinosaur time, and that's going to be a fun one. And I've heard a bunch of people say, I want to make sure I come for the dinosaur one. All right, so that's what we're talking about today. But I want to take it a little bit deeper. I'm taking the liberty to interpret this question a little bit. All right, so I'm going to go a little bit deeper than the dinosaurs, and I'm going to talk about maybe a deeper question. How does our faith and science interact? Because I think that's a little bit of what's behind the question, right? Because dinosaurs, it's paleontology, it's the study of dinosaurs. Well, how do dinosaurs and our faith interact? And because that's a great question. And that's an important question for us to tackle. It's a big question. It's one of the big questions, right? I think by the time you're in middle school and you start to go to science class, I think kids are already trying to figure out, how does this work together? If you grew up in the church and you know the Bible stories and you've heard them, and then you get introduced to science, and how does it all work together? And it's a question people ask starting at a young age, but then people just keep asking it and asking it. How does this all fit together? I don't understand, because the Bible, if we're Christians, the Bible is the foundation of our faith, right? I mean, the Bible, this is what we put our faith on, and Jesus, who's in the middle of the Bible, that's what we put our faith on. But science is really cool, and science helps us to do all these amazing things, and it helps us to understand the world, right? So science is really amazing, and the Bible's our foundation. Now, what happens when it might look like they don't fit? What happens when it looks like they contradict each other? What do we do with that? And that's one of the big questions in life. And it's a giant question. And I've just got, half an hour, 40 minutes to tackle it. But I'm going to have some fun with tackling this one, all right? And so what do we do with it? It's a tough question. I'm glad we asked it. This is we're not afraid of questions here at Heritage. Bring your questions, right? We welcome questions. We're not going to have all the answers, because science is a big thing. And faith is a big thing. I'm not smart enough to know everything about either, but we're going to tackle it and see how they fit together. And here's the thing, and I told my wife this morning, get ready, because this is my favorite topic. All right? I love talking about this, right? So it's my favorite topic. So this topic's going to be a little different from your typical sermon, all right? We're not going to go verse by verse through a specific passage. We'll tackle different verses throughout, but it's next week. Come back next week if you want verse by verse and theologically dense and intense, because next week is the question of, how do you really get saved? That's a big theological question. We're going to tackle tons of Bible verses next week. We're balancing it out this week to talk a little bit about science and how it all fits together with the Bible. And I want to get to some foundational parts, but before we talk about the dinosaurs, all right? Before we talk about the dinosaurs, before we talk about this guy over here, right? The dinosaurs are coming, but you're going to have to hold on a little bit. Before we talk about that, we're going to talk a bit about science, all right? For me, experiencing God's creation has led me to loving science. Now, I love God's creation. Who here loves God's creation? I mean, man, I love God's creation. As Justin said, we were spending all week in Salt Lake City, Utah for our national convention, in which I'm excited to tell you that now I got voted in as being on the national board over those 220 churches. So I'm on the national board now, so that's exciting. So helping lead this group with a bunch of people. It won't change my time here, but it'll be two meetings a year in different locations, and a lot of Zoom meetings and that kind of thing. But man, I'm excited about that. And we were out there hearing about all the things our churches are doing, and our churches, our 220 churches, sister churches in the country, you guys, they're doing amazing. In fact, I don't know if our conference has ever done this good. I mean, baptisms and church plants and just expanding, and there are good things going on. The whole conference, we're in the black, we're not in debt, right? Everything's being funded. It's amazing, and it's very encouraging. But me, if you know me, I like adventure, right? So I went out a day early. Salt Lake City, I've never been there before. It's right by the mountains. I went out a day early to go hiking, and I brought my backpack, my tent, I brought everything, right? I'm going to spend the first night at the top of a mountain in the snow, and I was excited about that until American Airlines messed me up and my baggage ended up in Dallas, right? So I had no backpack, no tent, right? I had the clothes on my back pretty much, but I said, I'm going hiking anyway, right? So I spent the whole day hiking. I hiked to the top of a mountain, got to the snow line, beautiful lake up there. I was up there and I met this guy who's similar to my age. I didn't have a lot of time. I was in a rush. It was a 12-mile hike. I started at 4. I just barely got back before dark. But I met a guy at the top, and we hiked down together. We hiked the 6 miles down together. And as we were walking, he was my age, and we were just talking about life, and he just said, oh, man. And we were just like, oh, this is so beautiful. We're in awe of God's creation. And we passed a family of mountain goats, and then a little later, there's like a giant moose with its little calf, and it was just nature everywhere, and fields of wildflowers we're walking through. And he says, isn't it awe-inspiring? And we started talking science, right? And National Institute of Health recently released a report to say that being in awe is so good for our brains. When you're in awe of the stars, when you look at the Grand Canyon, when you're in awe of creation, it actually is so healthy for our brains. It helps things run better. And even in Alzheimer's patients, having time to be in awe of something is good for our brains. We were talking about how incredible this is. And then he says something interesting. He says, you know why I think we're in awe of these things? And I said, okay, why do you think? Because when we were spirit children, before the earth was around, we were up there with Jesus watching it be created. And now what we're in it and we're born into this world, it's like deja vu. And I said, we're in Utah. Mormon, right? Mormon theology. There it is, right? There it is. Said, you must be Mormon. And I said, yes, I am. And just said, well, I can see that, So, but anyways, we had an amazing conversation. He started just pouring out his life. And he was my age, had kids my age. He just started sharing the struggles and heartbreak. And we're walking down there, and he said, I bet you didn't think you'd be doing pastoral counseling on your way down this hike, but I appreciate your counseling. And I got a chance to pray with him at the end. And I hope he finds his way into one of our sister churches in Utah, because you guys, our sister churches in Utah have thousands of people in them. And a lot of them are coming out of the LDS church. And so I hope he finds his way there. But we were in awe of God's creation. Early on in the year, I was in Death Valley with my daughter Cassidy, and as we were driving back late at night through the desert, we just had to stop and get out of the car and just look at the sky, and just the stars. Just incredible. I'm in awe of God's creation. And being in awe of God's creation has led me to a love for science, because I'm like, how is it that all this stuff works? And I want to share with you a little bit of geeking out on science, all right? So there's a space telescope called Hubble, and Hubble was launched 30 years ago, and it was the first space telescope, and it was a big deal. If you're older like me, you remember when that happened in the 80s, I think. And while Hubble was up there, it's an expensive telescope orbiting the Earth, a couple scientists got together and they said, we have an idea. We want to point the Hubble telescope at a small spot in space where there's nothing there. Nothing. And in fact, this spot was so small, if you put a grain of sand on your fingertip and went like that and looked up at the darkest spot in the sky, that grain of sand is where they pointed their telescope to. This small 1 millimeter by 1 millimeter point of space that was completely black. And they had to convince this expensive Hubble telescope people to point it where there was nothing. And that's weird, right? Because you should point it at something and then study it. But they pointed it at nothing. And they left the shutter open for 10 days. And after 10 days, they got this picture, right? There are 3,000 galaxies. Each one is a galaxy. In that grain of sand, black space, there were 3,000 galaxies. And they calculated it out, and that's when they made the calculation. I wonder how many stars there are in our Milky Way, and I wonder how many galaxies there are in the universe. And they came up with the number, there's 100,000 stars in our galaxy, and there's 100,000 galaxies. And that's amazing. And I'm going somewhere for this. Let me give you another picture in a minute. Then 5 years ago, they launched the James Webb Telescope. And the James Webb Telescope was amazing. And they did a very similar thing. It's called a deep field picture. They pointed it at nothing and just let it take all the information in, right? And that James Webb Telescope, the first image released was this one coming up here. And this one was really interesting because it was a different way of looking at the stars. And some of these galaxies are warped. And that was interesting, and that's because of Einstein's theory of general relativity, which means space and time are kind of flexible. And if you're looking at a spot with a deep gravity well, space and light will bend around it. And what that does is it makes a magnifying glass. So these areas, they're magnifying glasses that they can look even deeper than the telescope intended to look at. And so they looked the deepest they've ever looked into space. And they just said there's more and more, and the further they looked, the more they saw, and they came up with the calculation, no, there's more. There's 400 million stars in our galaxy, and there's 2 trillion galaxies. For every grain of sand on Earth, there's 100,000 stars. Now, what do you do with that, right? We can't even comprehend that. Here's 2 conclusions you can do with that. Number 1, you can look and say, science without God, my life is small and insignificant, right? So if you look at that and go like, there's no God, it's just science. What does your life look like? You are one among 8 billion people, right? On a little planet going around one of 8 times 10 to the 23rd number of stars. That's 80 with 23 zeros behind it. If you have science without God, guys, and no offense, you're nothing. You're going nowhere, and your life is soon going to be over, and it won't matter a bit, right? And that is science without God. And that's a little depressing. Now, some scientists, they're just like, no, that's just the way it is. That's not depressing. That's exciting. I'm just like, that doesn't sound exciting to me, right? That doesn't sound very hopeful to me. That doesn't give me a lot of purpose in life, right? That doesn't sound very meaningful. And then I think, when you get into that kind of philosophy, humanity just is not very important, right? And that's dangerous when you look at people as being not very important. But on the other hand, here's the thing. If you take science with God, if you put those 2 together, our life is extraordinary and meaningful. Just think, out of all those 8 times 10 to the 23rd power stars, here we are looking at them and trying to figure them out. This little planet, right? We have the capability to look up at the stars and wonder. And not only wonder where we fit in the universe, we can actually, we're figuring it out, right? How it all works together. You guys, this for me is one of my biggest evidences that we are created in the image of God Himself, who is the Creator, who created all this and then gave us the minds to figure it out. That's one of the for me, when I look at the stars and think, oh, we're so small, but I'm thinking We're so small, and where do I fit in? The fact that I'm thinking that is the evidence of God himself, because I'm created in his image. So I find that absolutely amazing. The fact that people do what people do is evidence of God for me. That just doesn't happen by accident. That's just not a fluke. It's just not by accident that we're launching the James Webb Telescope into space. Like, think about that, you guys. Let me geek out a little more. Are you all right? Are you all right? Okay, the James Webb Telescope. We made that thing out of stuff that we dug out of the dirt, right? We dug stuff out of the dirt, out of the ground, and made a telescope and put it on a rocket and then launched it 1 million miles from Earth. James Webb doesn't circle around the Earth. It's 1 million miles out, right? It took 30 days to get there. And when it got there, we parked it 1 million miles at the exact spot where the sun's gravity and the Earth's gravity equals out. And we parked it there so it's stationary in relationship to the earth as the earth goes around the sun. And then it turned away from the earth and put this big shield up to shield itself from any light from the earth, the sun, or the moon. And then it just stares into space and gives us back all that information. To me, that's evidence that we are created by a creator who's gifted us to do that. That's not by accident. That's not a fluke, right? We have purpose. We are meaningful. In the whole universe, we haven't seen any life out there yet. In the whole universe, we are the people who are figuring it out. That's evidence of who God is. Right? So to me, science doesn't diminish my understanding of God. Science, I'm not defensive over science. Science magnifies my understanding of who God is. 3,000 years ago, Isaiah looked up at the stars and he said this, "Lift your eyes up and look to the heavens." 3,000 years ago, he was doing the same thing that I love to do. Who created all these? It's because of his great power and mighty strength that not one of them is missing. 3,000, they didn't have it figured out. That's a pre-science person. But he looked up at the skies and said, oh man, God is so good. Right? The same thing that I do. Then David looked up at the skies as well. He said, the heavens declare the glory of God. The skies proclaim the works of his hands. Right? And you might think, well, that's 3,000 years ago. They just don't know what. No wonder they're attributing it to God because they don't have it figured out. But you guys, the top scientists who started to figure everything out, they were all Christians, right? Kepler, Copernicus, Galileo, Isaac Newton, they were all Christian people who, when they looked at the stars, when they looked at the earth, their first conclusion was, isn't God amazing, right? I think science, for me, science does not contradict the Bible. I think science magnifies God, all right? We're almost to the dinosaurs, right? We're getting close to the dinosaurs. We're not there yet, okay? We're going to get to the dinosaurs eventually. But let me talk a little more about science in general, all right? Francis Collins, I don't know if you've heard of him. He's arguably the most famous scientist living in America right now. I mean, this guy is incredible. He was put in charge of the Human Genome Project back under Clinton, and then he finished it under Bush. And this project, they were basically mapping the blueprint of DNA. It's the blueprint for how we're made and how we operate, right? And in mapping that blueprint, the blueprint is 3 billion DNA letters long in a specific order. And that's how our DNA all works together to make up who we are. And that was amazing. I remember when it got completed under Bush, there's a big celebration. And there's Francis Collins, right? He's heading up that whole project. What he found out was that people are 99.9% all the same. We have the same blueprint down to 0.1%. And that 0.1% is different. And that makes me bald and you and Jerry have hair. Right? That 0.1%, just 0.1%, right, means Logan's going to be tall and I'm going to be 5'8", right? So just that 0.1% makes our eye color, our skin color, our height, our hair, all that stuff. But we are 99.9% the same. So when people, and they always ask, my most often asked questions, are Canadians different from people in North Carolina? And just like, No, they're 99.9% the same. Are North Carolinians, they must be way different from Californians. No, they're 99.9% the same. And we are 100% created in God's image, right? We are set apart as humanity, right? We are not in the animal kingdom. We are set apart. We have a blueprint, right? We are created in God's image. And the more we understand science, for me, the more it just echoes how God has created us and put his fingerprint on our lives. So that's a little bit about Francis Collins, but he went on to serve as the director of the NIH, right? The director of the NIH for the longest time anybody's ever served as the director of the NIH. He was the director there under Obama, Trump, and Biden, right? And the NIH is one of the top scientific organizations in all of America. So the guy's arguably the most brilliant scientist in America. And here's some quotes from him. He said, as he thought about the universe, I found there was an elegance and a beauty about the universe that cried out for an explanation beyond itself. When he looked at the universe, he said, there's got to be a better explanation than just science. He went on to say this about biology and about the Human Genome Project. The more I learn about the human genome, the more it convinces me of the elegance of God's design. Francis Collins is an evangelical Christian, right? The smartest, most well-known scientist in America. He's an evangelical Christian who loves to play guitar and lead worship at church, right? Sometimes we think that there's the scientists and there's us and there's a battle and we got to fight the things, right? But I'm telling you guys, 60%, a little less than the average American, 60% of scientists in America believe in God, right? Because I believe when they start looking into this, they just go, wow, how is this is built so amazing. This is miraculous. And even as we try to figure it out, I think the more we try to figure out, the more miraculous it seems. So there's a lot of evidence, right? There's a lot of science that points towards God. Science is amazing, but it's not our foundation. All right? As amazing as science is, and I love science, we can't build our life on science. It's not our foundation. Jesus said in Matthew 7:24, therefore, everyone who hears these words of mine and puts them into practice is like a wise man who builds his house on the rock, right? We can't build our lives on science, right? We can't do that, but we can build our lives on the words of Jesus and then putting them into practice. That's our foundation. So as we think about science, right? Let's think about what is foundational. What comes before science in our lives? Because I believe faith comes before science. Right? Science is great, but faith is our foundation. So when it comes to faith and science, what is foundational? Because we can disagree on the small details, but we should agree on the foundation. And this is like what I did with politics, right? Politics, we can disagree on some, policies and that kind of thing. But as a foundation, as Christians, we can all agree on our foundational principles. And the same thing we did with alcohol, pot, and tattoos, right? We might disagree on some nuances of those arguments, but we can agree on the foundation of our faith, which is centered on Jesus, and the Bible is our source for truth, right? We can agree on these foundations. So when we think about science, what is foundational? What's foundational? God is the creator. That's foundational, right? When science says God is not the creator, I'm just like, well, okay, that's your opinion. But for me, God is the creator. That is a foundation that I'm going to build my life on, right? Science and God go together so much better than when you remove God from science. So science and God go together. And the Bible is not a science textbook, right? Imagine if God would have started explaining quantum mechanics to Abraham. Right? Wouldn't have worked, right? He wasn't ready for Abraham to know that yet, or astrophysics, or all these things. God waits for the right time to reveal himself, and he knows all about quantum mechanics, even though we haven't figured that one out yet. But God knows all these things, but he chose to reveal to that pre-scientific culture, right, reveal the right things at the right time, in the right language, that they might understand the point of it all, which is God has created you, and God has a plan for you, and you have meaning. Right? God wanted to get the point across, and he didn't get into the fine details on everything about the how part. But God's the creator. We're created in his image, and we're set apart. You know, when science will say, oh, we're just animals, we're just complicated animals, I'm just like, no, we are set apart for a purpose, created in the image of God. God didn't create anything else in his image. God created us in his image. Right? We're created in his image, and that's amazing. Humans are special. You know, we might have the physical attributes of mammals, but we are not animals, right? We are set apart. We're special. That's a foundation. We're created in his image. Another foundation, the supernatural is real, especially the Jesus part. Because sometimes we've talked about slippery slopes in some of these Ask Anything series. Sometimes scientists try to explain everything away by science, right? Well, that miracle when they crossed the Red Sea, that was probably because this happened, and this climate thing happened, and when he struck the rock, well, there's a kind of rock, some water might come out, and you know, sometimes, and it kind of annoys me, right? When scientists or people will try to explain away every miracle in the Bible. You guys, some things are just miracles. Right? They can't be explained away. The only way you can explain them is, that doesn't make any sense. God did that. Right? God did that one. And when you start to explain away every miracle in the Bible, you're going to get down to the most important miracle in the Bible. The most important one. And that's the resurrection of Jesus. And when you start to try to explain, well, maybe it's just figurative, or maybe he wasn't dead, you know, all these things, Paul would say, if there's no resurrection, our faith is meaningless. If there's no resurrection, there is no Christian faith, right? So that is a bit of the slippery slope of science when you start to explain away all the miracles. No, there is natural and there's supernatural. And we're not going to explain the supernatural. God's doing that. It's beyond us. We don't know. It's God doing it. And for most importantly, Jesus rose from the dead. And it was the most important miracle in the Bible. And it's on that one that we hang our faith, right? Jesus is the center of everything we do. If he didn't raise from the dead, sin and death wouldn't be broken, and we're all condemned, right? So that is so important. The supernatural is real, especially the Jesus part. The next one, the Bible can be trusted. The Bible can be trusted, even though it has to be interpreted. And some people say, the Bible says it, and I'm doing it, and that's that. The Bible is not easy, right? The Bible is not easy. And as I was preparing for this sermon, right, I'm going into Genesis, and I actually read 4 different views, and we'll talk about that when we talk about the dinosaurs in a minute. Hold on, all right? 4 different views of Genesis, right? And it focuses in on what does the word day mean. In Hebrew, it's the word yom, Y-O-M. And I'm telling you guys, there are entire books written on that one word. There are books written on the word day in Genesis. And so if you think the Bible is easy to be interpreted, it's not. It's pretty complicated, but it's amazing. It's absolutely amazing, and it is truth. We can trust it, the historicity of it, the authenticity of it. We can trust the Bible, but we have to interpret it, and that's a life of searching. But it's fun. It's great. I love it. The Holy Spirit guides us into all truth. So the Bible can be trusted, even though it needs to be interpreted. So finally, what about the dinosaurs? Right? What about the dinosaurs? You guys, I love dinosaurs. Who here loves dinosaurs, man? I love as a kid, every kid loves dinosaurs, right? One of the first toys I bought my girls was a pet Tyrannosaurus Rex, right? I'm just like, yes, I get to buy dinosaurs again because my kids are young. This is amazing, right? I love dinosaurs. I think, for me, dinosaurs proclaim the greatness of God. For me, when I see dinosaurs, I go, man, it's amazing enough that there's the biodiversity that we see in our world today. Man, the biodiversity throughout the history of the earth is mind-blowing, right? For me, dinosaurs proclaim the glory of God. Just like the heavens declare the glory of God, creation declares the glory of God, science declares the glory of God, dinosaurs, for me, declare the glory of God. Psalm 111 verse 2 says, "Great are your works of the Lord. They are pondered by all who delight in them." God's works are so great that we just have to think about them. And we have to ponder them, right? I'm amazed at the dinosaurs, but more amazed than the dinosaurs, I'm amazed that people can understand paleontology, which is the study of fossils, to try to figure them out. Right? Here we are pondering these things that have been buried in the dirt, right? And we're trying to figure it out. And for me, the dinosaurs are great, but people that we're trying to figure these things out, it's amazing. To me, it just points to God, right? Science doesn't diminish our view of God, it magnifies it. But let me take and interpret that question just a little bit more. So the question was, what about the dinosaurs? And then I went off into, what about science? I think what's maybe really behind what about the dinosaurs is, when were the dinosaurs, right? And that's a question that I know in this congregation we're going to have differences on, right? That's why we build a foundation first. Right? Creation declares the glory of God, right? We can all agree on these foundations, but I think people in this congregation are going to differ in their views about when were the dinosaurs. So let me give you, as I've been reading a book all this week on 4 different views of when the dinosaurs were and how science and faith all fit together. Let me give you the 4 different views of when the dinosaurs were. All right? So there's 4 different views on it. There's young earth creationism, right? That's one view. In that view, the earth is 6,000 years old. It was created in 6 24-hour days, right? And the dinosaurs, what about the dinosaurs? They lived with people, and then the flood came, and a couple of the small ones got on the ark, but the rest got wiped out. Right? And then as the ark came to a rest, and there's a global flood and all that, and then the dinosaurs, the couple that got onto the ark, they didn't last long. Someone ate them. Literally, that's what, they say. Some probably hunted them and ate them because people were expanding across the globe, right? And species would go extinct and all that. But that is the view of young earth creationism. A part of one of the ideas, the flood caused most of the geological features that scientists would view as being old, right? So the flood caused all that. Or God created it already looking old, right? When God created the earth, He put all that oil in there for us to drive our cars with nowadays, right? And he put those stars, there was no Big Bang, but the stars were created where they are now. And they're still moving, right? But they were created in place. So that's young earth creationism. And that's, and you guys, I'm not going to spend a lot of time going on all that. You could talk forever about all these things, right? These are big topics, right? But Ken Ham, if you want to hear more, Ken Ham and Answers in Genesis that he founded, that organization, they run the Ark Experience in Kentucky, and that would be young earth creationism. So that is one view of where the dinosaurs fit in, right? Young earth creationism. Then there's old earth creationism. Here's another view. And so here, God directly created, God created everything, right? God's the creator. And in all these views, these are Christian views. I'm not talking about non-Christian views. There's lots of those too. These are Christian views of the age of the earth and where the dinosaurs all fit in. So old earth creationism, God created everything, but that day God created in day 1, day 2, day 3, those are really long days. Because, for God, time means nothing, right? So all of those days could have been 24 hours, it could have been 1,000 years, it could have been 1,000,000 years, it could have been 1,000,000,000 years. God has no time. And that's what we believe. God has no time. And they'll point out, it's interesting, Psalm 90 verse 4, and I don't have a slide for that, but Psalm 90 verse 4, Psalm 90 is the only psalm attributed to Moses. I don't know if you knew that. So most of the songs are David or David's music director, but Psalm 90 is the only one that Moses wrote. And Psalm 90 is where we find out, where we read, 1,000 years in your sight are like a day, that just one has gone by, or like a watch in the night. So Moses said 1,000 years in God's sight are like a day, or maybe even shorter than a day, like just a night watch, which is like 6 hours. And Moses is the guy who also wrote Genesis, right? So Moses has a bit of a different definition of day, and that's where an old earth creationism person will say that, okay, those days are just really long. And the dinosaurs came on day 6, but they came in the morning. And by the time they were extinct, Adam and Eve came at the end of era 6, not really day 6, but that era, that 6th era. And they believe in the eras, right? 1 through 6 eras, but they're just really long. So that day 6 was a really long day because the dinosaurs came and went, and then Adam and Eve came at the end. And they would believe in a literal Adam and Eve, and they would reject evolution. So that's old earth creationism. A guy named Hugh Ross, he's an astrophysicist. He created an organization called Reasons to Believe. And so that's old earth creationism. Then there's evolutionary creation. All right? Evolutionary creation. God is still the creator of everything. The Bible is still the truth. And it fits fine with evolution. Right? And that's the belief. And what they would say that God, the evolutionary process is a tool used by God to create. He guided it along the way. And at one point, the people were ready. I don't know if the timer went off on the oven. People were ready, and then he put his spirit into them, or his image into them. They're ready. They're in my image now, but it took them a while to bake, I guess. Right? So that would be evolutionary creationism. And that is Francis Collins, and founder of BioLogos. BioLogos means bio is life, and logos is the word. Life comes from the word of God. Right? So they are Christians, right? But they believe in evolution, and God guided that. And the fourth one, intelligent design. And this one's a little different. This one, intelligent design, take no stance on the time frame, or they say you could be young earth, you can be old earth. It doesn't really matter. In fact, that's dividing people. The fact is that we see evidence of God everywhere. And so they don't take a stand on Adam and Eve or this and that. They're not worried about all those fine details. They just say, look to these cells. Those were created in the image of God. Look to the universe. That shows the image of God. Look to all this stuff. There's evidence of a designer. So they're kind of like a neutral party. They said, don't worry about the details. Just look, God created it all. So those are the 4 different tracks of Christian belief. And in the book that I read this week, and it gave each different argument, and then arguments for the arguments, and each tract argued the other person, right? And it's just fascinating. It's interesting stuff. And you guys, I don't have all the answers. All right? So I don't have all the answers, and I'm going to be honest with you guys. When it comes to the Bible, like my favorite part is right over here. The Gospels. I'm a middle Bible guy, all right? When you look at the beginning of the Bible, yeah, I like Genesis, but it's confusing sometimes, right? There's a lot of speculation. I love reading it. I know why. I know the purpose behind it, but the speculation on how it all happened, guys, I don't spend a lot of time thinking about that. Just like I don't spend a lot of time thinking about the last one, right? So Genesis and Revelation, I don't spend a lot of time. They're great books of the Bible. They're all true, right? But all the speculation on what's going to happen at the end of the world, I mean, a lot of it's speculation. It's interpretation. There's a million different interpretations on it. I've got ideas on it, right? But I don't spend a lot of time. I spend most of my time right in the middle. Because the Jesus part, I can apply that to my life right now. The Jesus part, I can follow Jesus right now. The Jesus part makes a difference in my life. It's practical, it's inspirational, it's the most important part anyways, right? It all revolves around Jesus. He's the center of the Bible. He's the center of everything we do. Guys, I don't spend a lot of time thinking about I love science, but I don't propose to know all the answers, right? So, for me, though, I will just let you know, for me, when scientists come up and say the earths are millions of years old or whatever, I don't get defensive over that. That doesn't bother me, right? I don't have all the answers, but that doesn't bother me. God is beyond time. And for him, billions of years are nothing. We can't even write, he's eternal, right? Side note, can I give you a side note about science? All right, side note, and the people are just, no, we're done. We're done with this, Chris. Yep. So side note, when it comes to time, because of the theory of relativity, right? People have taken the Bible, and they used to be like God existed, like he's always been, and he can look backwards in time, and he knows what's going to happen, but he's in the present at the same time. That's crazy. That makes no scientific sense. But because of the theory of relativity, scientists now are like, oh, that's actually plausible. Scientifically, theoretically, looking backwards and forwards in time, according to Einstein's theory, is actually scientifically, theoretically possible. They're just like, oh yeah, well that does make sense. You know, the Bible was just written in such a way where they thought, wow, that's impossible. And now scientists are, no, that is actually possible, right? So I find it amazing. So I'm not bothered about the time thing. You guys are going to come to different conclusions on that. The point is, science is not something we have to be worried about. For me, science magnifies and expands who God is. So what do we do with that? What do Christians do with science? I think for we got to look at it through the lens of what is our foundation, right? We're not going to change our foundational principles, but we're going to stand on those and go, praise God that he's given us the ability to start to figure these things out. And science is always changing, and they're always figuring out new things and changing their ideas, but we're standing on a solid foundation of who God is and that we are created meaningful and purposeful and amazing. There's a guy named Louis Pasteur, and anybody know what Louis Pasteur is famous for? Pasteurization, right? It's in the milk we drink right now. That's why it doesn't kill us, although there's probably some raw milk fans out here. I know there are, right? But Louis Pasteur, he discovered germs, right? Germs are the things that spread disease, right? He was the first one to wrap his mind around vaccinations and came up with pasteurization. And he said this, he said, a little science distances you from God, but much science brings you nearer to him. Right? That's what he said. Romans 1, verse 19 and 20, and we'll close on this verse. And I'll ask the praise team to come on up. Romans 1, verse 19 and 20. For since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, his eternal power, and his divine nature have been clearly seen, being understood from what has been made. And Jacob, you can take this TV if you want. I'm done reading it. So there you go. So with the creation of the world, with God's invisible qualities, we can see God's power in what has been made. So for you guys, I have a heart for our young people, right? Our young adults, our kids, most of them are on stage, right? Our young adults. I have a heart for our young adults, and I know that for a lot of people as they go from high school into college, they hear about the science, they hear about all the different things, and it puts a major stumbling block of doubt in front of them. And I've heard so many people who step away from their faith because science and faith just doesn't look like it works. And I want to challenge you guys, and maybe that's any of us here. I want to challenge us that don't let science stop you from believing in who God is. For me, science points to the Creator, right? Don't let that be a stumbling block. You can strain your brain over science. You can celebrate all the amazing things that people do. And for me, it just shouts out of a Creator. So you don't need to make that it's either this or this. No, if you're standing on the foundation, right? If you know what your foundation is, you can praise God for the amazing people who create all these things, because we can only do that because we're created in his image. So my prayer is that if there's doubt, if you've walked away, if you're thinking of walking away, if you think it can't be compatible, oh yes it can, right? And embrace your faith. And don't let that be something that stops you. All right? Let's pray.